Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to this TechTrain event for October 2020. TechTrain is a monthly event. It's organized by Kronos, but it's open to anyone, where we take a look at topics from the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. And today we have as a guest Thomas Vochten, who will talk about Microsoft Teams. So we'll switch over to him.
Yes,
and
hello.
The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. My voice is leaving me today due to the numerous meetings I've had, so I hope it will. Be okay. We'll see. Yeah. All right, I'm just going to share the presentation. Bear with me. With a little bit of luck, and I'm sure you will interrupt me if you don't see my screen. Then we can get started.
Yeah, it'll be good
okay.
Now.
All right. So provisioning Microsoft Teams, that will be the topic of today. But before we start, just a little bit about myself. My name is Thomas Vochten. I work for the Kronos Group as a technology evangelist, which means I like to talk about technology. That's probably also why I'm an MVP. I'm also the president of BWIG, which is the user group that deals with Microsoft 365 collaboration, communication topics. If you've got any questions after this presentation, you can, probably the best way to reach me is through Twitter. I have a blog, but yeah, it's maybe more of an announcements platform for my technical sessions. Then you will find interesting content there. And you can also send me an email if you want. I will always answer, maybe not immediately, but if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me afterwards. We'll have some time for questions through the Q&A after the presentation. So that's also possible. Okay, we're going to talk about Teams provisioning, but before we dive into more technical details, this is a tech train after all. We probably have to take a step back and think about the business, or about what we are trying to solve here. Why do we want an engine to control Teams creation? That's the main question here. There are numerous ways, and probably much more than are on this slide, but one of the main ones is to avoid teams and groups creation sprawl. Sprawl is a fantastic English word, which means basically, well, we've got teams everywhere, we've got chaos. I mean, like it said in the abstract, I met an organization once who had maybe 20 people as employees, and after a few weeks after they switched on Teams, they ended up with maybe 300 teams or something. So I'm not saying that's always a bad thing. It always depends, and that's a theme that, of course, will be recurrent during this presentation. It always depends, but still, many organizations want to control the amount of teams and groups, because a team is actually a group with some extra functionality. You can consider it that way, to control the chaos. And a lot of teams, is that bad? Not necessarily. It depends, I think. There are a gazillion ways to create groups and teams in Office 365. Many users don't even realize they're creating a team. For example, when creating a planner dashboard, you're creating a group, for example. Many people don't realize that. So to avoid sprawl, sometimes it's also because the IT department doesn't want to end up with 25 different or 200 different groups, because every team is a group, and they want to have a little bit more control over what happens. That could be a reason, but most of the time there are other reasons. For example, if you've got different types of teams, for example, a typical team would be a team to manage a project, or a team to do some project management, finances, stuff like that. Typical scenarios in which you might want to leverage Teams templates, for example. And in a template, you can reuse certain artifacts. You can have a predefined list of channels or tabs or connections to, I don't know, Power BI, stuff like that, the usual connections. And through the use of Teams templates, that all becomes possible. Something else is that to reduce manual intervention. And okay, by default, users can just create a team, and everyone can do so. There is a button in Teams, create a new team, and everyone can do that. We all know that. But if you want to have a process or a more involved process, you can have a provisioning engine to also reduce manual intervention, but not only from the IT administrators, but also for the users. Let's say you have a typical scenario, a secretary who has to create a team for every new customer engagement that is created in the company. I've seen people use checklists like this, 2 pages long. Okay, create this channel, create that channel, add these people, create a private channel, stuff like that. Add 2 tabs, add a bot, do stuff. And that is always, that's error prone, of course, and it's a lot of repetition, which takes a lot of time, and which makes that people make errors, and we don't want that. A big part of using teams successfully is coming up with let's say a governance strategy, and governance can be around topics like naming, like who has access, like who can access your teams. Do we enable external sharing, yes or no, and how? Stuff like that. Do we have certain approval flows if you want to create a team? Stuff like that. Do we have to have one or at least 2 owners, for example? Many organizations create a governance document, and a provisioning engine is a good way to maybe enforce these governance policies, or at least diffuse them. And we also know that consistency supports user adoption. That means if your users are used to work with a team in a certain way, that using a template or using a provisioning engine to do things in a very consistent way will absolutely help user adoption. So that's quite cool. So whatever you do, and whatever provisioning engine you create, and I'm going to demonstrate you a pretty involved one, but there are also very simple provisioning engines. I'll also show you a few of those that can be pretty simple. Whatever you do, make it transparent and simple and predictable. Because if the one side of the balance is that users can create a team by themselves and it takes 3 seconds to create a team, the other side of the balance is that you have to fill in a form with 25 pages. There are 25 approvals that have to be approved, and after 5 days you get your team. Well, you know what's going to happen. People are not going to use Teams, and maybe they are just going to store files on their OneDrive and share that with someone else in a structural way, which we absolutely don't want. So whatever you do, make it transparent and simple. Many customers I visit or many organizations I go to and I talk about provisioning, first reaction is usually, well, if you go to the IT people, first reaction is usually, well, yes, we want to control the teams that get created. Second reaction is, yeah, why would we have to do so? Because if we have a very involved process, it will take days before the team gets created. Someone else I know created a very unscientific Twitter poll last year, in which she asked, okay, SharePoint Teams site or Microsoft Teams provisioning, what is your organization currently doing? Around 61%, if I do a quick calculation, of companies don't let their users freely create teams. I must say that I was a little bit surprised, because many of the companies or customers I visit, people can create teams freely. So I was a little bit surprised there, but she's from Canada. Maybe in Canada or in the US, it's a little bit a different situation. I don't know, but it quite surprised me. So 34% of the people manually created by IT, 35% of people let end users create them, 27% had a provisioning solution, and 4% something else. I don't know what the something else was, but so in this session, we're going to look at custom solutions, things you can create yourself, program yourself, configure yourself. But of course, there's also ready-made engines available on the market that do exactly the same thing. It really depends on the costs, on the budget, on the complexity, on a lot of different factors. If you go for a custom-made solution, or if you go for something that is already on the market, and if you want to know which companies create those solutions, the usual ones in the, let's say, the Microsoft 365 collaboration and communication ecosystem, the F-Points, the ShareGates, the Valos, and Provision Point. There are like 25 companies who do provisioning and usually also governance solutions. They all have some product that does something with Teams provisioning and Teams governance, because that always goes hand in hand. Today, I'm going to talk about how you can create teams through a provisioning solution, but it's equally important to also have a tool to automate your governance. For example, if you establish that every team has to have at least 2 owners, you want to have something that actually checks that after the team has been created. So governance solutions and provisioning solutions usually go hand in hand. Okay, if we talk about provisioning a team, what are some of the usual topics that we want to include inside of the provisioning process? When it comes to Teams artifacts, we probably want an initial structure and maybe even some content. So it's possible to, of course, when you provision a team, create your team with a certain naming convention, but then you probably also want some structure. And that means in Teams, that means channels initially. Maybe you want some predefined channels, like in a project, you probably want a channel for finance, a channel for planning, a channel for, I don't know, deliverables, sorry, stuff like that. An initial structure and maybe also some content, because it's also possible, if we're talking about the channel for deliverables, to include some templates, for example, documents or other artifacts that you want to have present in your team after creation, so people are ready to start using it. Something else is standard security and compliance settings. For example, the ability to do external sharing and all the configuration around that. That is possible, but also compliance settings. Or maybe sensitivity labels, stuff like that. All the Microsoft 365 and Azure related security settings can be attached to a certain team, and that's something you can also pre-provision if you want. You can establish a well understood ownership. We already talked about that, so that everyone, when they create a team, have to think about, okay, who are the owners of the team and what does that mean? Which responsibilities come into play? Something else that is often done to Teams provisioning is, for example, making some kind of training mandatory. It's not on this slide, but that's also something that is very common, is that after you create a team or after you ask for a team, is that you get presented with a page in SharePoint or somewhere else where all the rules and maybe also some pointers to help desk documents get provided for you, so that you know if you're provisioning a project team or an event team or whatever, that you know exactly what the things are that you should do and should not do. That could also be the tie to your governance document. Something else is establish a content lifetime or a team's lifetime or a team's life cycle. Something that you could also do to provisioning. For example, you could make sure that a team will get archived after 6 months if it's not being used anymore or something like that. Usually, there is also some kind of approval flow, although I've seen customers who have a provisioning engine that gathers additional information apart from the ones that you have to provide, even when provisioning a team out of the box, and don't include an approval flow. And in some organizations, we will have an approval flow. Don't make that too complicated. Don't let every team created be approved by your N+1, your N+1+1, etc. That will make, that will certainly not help user adoption. So don't do that. Make it simple. But you don't have to use an approval flow. In my demonstration, I'm going to implement a simple approval flow that I will demonstrate. And if you do it right, your team's creation will be predictable and consistent. And like we said already, that will help user adoption. So manually creating all these items or manually establishing these governance policies and checking them is really labor intensive and error prone. And it's also a very, very repetitive task that you want to avoid if you're an IT person, or you don't want to have your business users do that all the time. So, but a lot of these functionalities that we talked about are provided to us by something that is already there out of the box, and that's templates. There are some built-in templates, and that's relatively new, I would say. In the beginning, we didn't have any templates. There are a few provided out of the box. I'm not going to read throughout the whole list, of course, but there are some very obvious ones like manage a project or manage an event, onboard employees, and then a few other ones related to a specific vertical. Those templates can be leveraged by you. You can also build upon them or maybe reuse them. And that's what most people do. And that's for many organizations, the basis of their provisioning engine, because it provides consistency. Whenever we create a new project, we will have these channels available. So that's there are some other templates available to small and medium businesses, but these are the ones that are generally available. So there are other ones. This is just a small example of the Manage an Event template and what it provides. Usually you will see that these templates provide basic functionality. They will provide channels and apps. So channels, these are just, this is the list that is included, general announcements, budget, and so on, and a few apps. And those apps are usually, especially for the out-of-the-box ones, are out-of-the-box services like YouTube or Planner, in this case for Manage an Event. What you cannot do through templates is have more involved capabilities, like automatically including a specific bot or a specific security setting. Well, there are some things that you can do, but you're really limited. But nevertheless, these templates are really quite useful. If you want to create a template, there are a few possibilities. You can clone an existing template or the standard template. So if you just go to create new team, you will get a default team, which is created out of the standard template. You can use that template or one of the ones that I showed you in the list. You can also create a template from an existing team, and you can create a template from scratch. Cloning an existing template and creating a template from an existing team, that's something that an end user would be able to do, or someone from IT, because you can just do that through the user interface if you want. I'll show you in a few seconds how that works. But if you're a more technical user, you can, or developer, you can also do that from scratch. And of course, it's the modern day, so everything is JSON. Creating these templates through a template definition is also a JSON file. And you can see that we not only able to specify different channels or different properties, but also certain capabilities. For example, the fun settings. Do we allow Giphies in our team? Do we allow custom memes in our team? But also more, let's say, more serious settings, like is our team public or private? Is it discoverable? Stuff like that. And then you're also specifying the list of apps that you want to be able to create. Of course, this is not for everyone. If you're not a technical user, you won't be able to create your own template definition. But if you're just going for the user interface, there are quite some interesting possibilities already. And let me, as an intermezzo, quickly show you how Teams templates work. I'm going to share my screen now instead of the slides. Bear with me. Right. So if we go to the Teams admin center, and I suppose someone will shout if you don't see anything. So this is the Teams admin center. I haven't changed anything here. So the templates you see here are the ones that we talked about in the slide. So we've got, well, especially I've created one custom one. You have manage a project, manage an event, onboard employees, etc., etc. You've got some well, general information. Most of them are provided to us out of the box, but I've created a custom one here called TechTrain. And then through a relatively simple configuration screen, you can customize the screen. For example, you can add channels. This is really straightforward, of course. Let's do it. Hello, channel user adoption doesn't really matter. Shown by default, yes. And we don't really want an app. Oops. Apply. And we changed our template. It's as simple as that. What do we see here? We see templates. We see channels. Sorry. We see certain predefined tabs. We've got Power BI. We've got team information, which is a OneNote tab. And then in different channels, we've got different kinds of integrations in tabs. What you can also do is use emoticons, what many people do right here, like in announcements or budget. I include a little sack of money to make it a little bit more clear what the channel is about. But that's about it. You cannot attach, let's say, custom logic or specific or very specific functionalities here. That's not possible. You are able to customize the list of applications that will be made available, and these are all the ones that are provided out of the box. I just copied one and I added Power BI. That's my TechTrain template. And if you want to add a template, you have the choice that we already talked about. You can create a brand new template. You can use an existing team as a template, which is what many people use, especially the people who are not in IT. And you can start with an existing template. So if you use an existing team as a template, you will get the choice. That's what's available to you. So I already created one. So I created the TechTrain. Let's try to see how that works, because if you just want to use templates and you haven't configured anything, people still have this button here on the left, on the low-hand left side of the screen, join or create a team. And if you click join or create a team, users are able to, well, create a team. So you've got more or less the same options here. You can create a team from scratch, from a group or a team, or from these predefined templates. And my TechTrain template is here. Then you get an overview of what artifacts will be configured, and then you get the usual questions like which name, which description, who is the owner, initial members, etc., etc. We're not going to do that because everyone in this call probably knows how to create a team. It is important that this button, join or create a team, is there by default. And like we said, everyone in your organization by default is able to create a team. If you do not want that because you have a provisioning solution in place, you can restrict access to teams or groups creation, in fact, in your tenant, so that people who are not part of this group will not see this button anymore, and they will be forced to use your provisioning solution. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. So that's mainly the difference. Let me switch back to the slides. There we are. So those were the Teams templates. Now, if you're just looking for simple functionality, you just want to have a template, well, you're actually done, because you don't need a provisioning solution if this is all what you want. It's only if you want additional capabilities like approvals or very involved checks or something else that you want to do. Yeah, of course, you need a provisioning solution. But if you want out-of-the-box behavior with just a template, that's it. If you want to ask other questions that are not available to the standard or the default Teams creation dialogues, well, then you, of course, need something else. Now, if we want to create a team, no matter what technology we use within the Microsoft ecosystem, there is really only one thing you really need to know about, and that's the Microsoft Graph. You've probably already heard about the Microsoft Graph. The Microsoft Graph is a system that connects all the different services in Office 365, well, I should say Microsoft 365 together, and it provides you access, or also programmatic access, to everything there is in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. And the graph can be leveraged through virtually all program languages. There are SDKs for C#, for TypeScript, for JavaScript, for PowerShell even. And it can also be leveraged to Power Automate or other technologies. So most of these functionalities are provided through the current production endpoint. Also, there's also a beta endpoint that I'm going to use today in my demonstration. So the Microsoft Graph is the API that you need to know. Now, I'm not a developer. I know my way around Visual Studio. I know just enough .NET to be dangerous. I know quite some PowerShell. I can format a JSON file that doesn't that validates. That's about it. But I'm not a developer myself. But there are other ways to use the Microsoft Graph to provision teams or do anything else that is available into the Microsoft Graph. And I'm going to use a few of those in my demonstration. But you can use the Microsoft Graph not only to create teams, but also to update teams, to delete teams, to archive teams, to provision stuff inside the team, to put messages there, to put other artifacts, documents, stuff like that, to read your calendar, to tie everything together. It's like a mesh, and that's what the graph enables us to do. If we look at specific Teams actions within the Microsoft Graph, these are a few of the typical actions or typical workflows that we are using in a provisioning engine for Microsoft Teams. On the top of the circle, of course, creating a team, that's quite self-evident. We want to add members and owners. We want to configure all the necessary team settings. We want to add channels, we want to install applications, add specific tabs, and later on we might archive or delete a team. There are enormous possibilities to create, update, and delete teams, set all possible settings. That everything is available to you. The Microsoft documentation on docs.microsoft.com, and I have a reference to the Teams Graph API documentation later on in the presentation is quite good, and it will tell you everything you need to know. So definitely check that out. If you want to do anything with the Microsoft Graph, of course, well, you need to do authentication and authorization. If you're using PowerShell with the Microsoft Graph, or even if you're creating your custom web application in Azure Web Apps, that uses the graph to do something with Teams to make a provisioning engine, well, your application needs to have an identity. That's the authentication part, and you need to register it in Azure Active Directory in the enterprise applications part, and that's what you have to do for any application that uses the Graph API, and they can specify very specific permissions. You can say, well, this application or this PowerShell script, because that's also an application when it comes to Azure AD, has the rights to create teams. That's on the middle of the slide. It has rights to read all the teams that are available, to read user profiles, and well, this is just a very small sample of all the different permissions that you can grant to your application. Be aware, of course, don't overdo it, because you don't want to have an application having all the available rights and then messing up your whole Azure Active Directory or something like that. So be very careful and be very specific about the permissions that you want to grant your application. There are two types of authorization possible. You can have your application run as the user who is initiating the call, or you can have your application, that's called delegated permissions, or you can have your application run as with application permissions. If you have an application that needs to run as the application itself and wants to create teams or do something with teams or user profiles, you also have to grant access to that API for your whole tenant, and that's not something that everyone can do. You have to have the certain amount of access to do so. So there's always two parts. Authentication, you have to register your application. You have to generate a client ID or a secret, or a client ID and a certificate. That's what I'm using in my demonstration to make it a little bit more secure than just having some kind of password lying around. And then the authorization part is granting your application permissions. Once you've done that, you can work with the Microsoft Graph. This is an example of how you would do it the manual way. So if you're a programmer, you will immediately recognize what is being done here. We're using HTTP to post to a certain endpoint specific for Teams, and we give it a JSON object, and then in this case, a team will get created. That's basically more or less what it does. But you don't have to do it like this, because this is all manual. If you're using, like say, JavaScript, for example, you will want to do it this way. You can also do it, for example, through a Power Automate or Logic Apps. I'm also going to use Logic Apps later on in the presentation. But this is the data structure that is required. Now, this is a minimal example because we're copying the properties of the standard Teams template. But if you want to have something totally different, well, the JSON file will be a lot longer, of course. And then it also depends on which permission model you're working with, application permissions, like in this example, or with delegated permissions. But that will lead us a little bit too far, I guess. So you can go the manual way of creating teams through the Microsoft Graph, so programmatically, or you can use PowerShell if you want. There are different ways to create teams through PowerShell. I know at least 3. There are maybe more. Well, there is probably 4 ways to do that. Or you can leverage built-in graph support, which is available in products like Power Automate, Power Apps, or Logic Apps, and maybe also other ones. So it's not because we're using the Microsoft Graph that you have to be a developer. I will show you through Logic Apps or through Power Automate that you can leverage the Microsoft Graph without having to really code all these HTTP calls. That's what we can do here. All right. So Power Automate and Logic Apps are quite similar, and I will show you both of them. Logic Apps is Power Automate is part of the Power Platform, and Logic Apps is part of Azure. They have very similar user interface, as you will notice. The capabilities are also quite similar, but Logic Apps lives in Azure. So, and it has different requirements also from a licensing perspective. I've got customers who start out in Power Automate and then migrate to Logic Apps because they want to use a very specific functionality that is not available in Power Automate, or is available but only if they pay a large premium. So it really depends. If you look at the different capabilities, the different features, the different building blocks that you can use to build your application, well, there are many, many choices, and this is just a sample. You can go the custom route or the completely custom route and build a custom web application using, I don't know, .NET, and then leverage the Microsoft Graph, give users a web application that you built from scratch, and they can ask for a team. That's possible. You can go the other way. You can do Power Automate, which is, I would not say no code, but low code. It's something you can drag and drop, configure. You have to have a little bit of knowledge of the Excel-like syntax for to make some stuff done, but it's fairly, I wouldn't say simple, but it's definitely simpler than creating your custom web application. That's Power Automate. Power Apps, which will provide you with a user interface. You can also use things like Microsoft Forms. If you don't want to use Power Apps, that's also possible. And then you have to have an engine that makes your code run. That can be Power Automate, but it can also be Azure Automation if you want, through PowerShell, or Azure Functions. Azure Functions can run PowerShell, also can run real programming languages, of course. That's everyone knows that. But those can be, I'm using Azure Functions a bit at the end of the session, but yeah, there are endless possibilities. Also, if you look at Teams itself, we talked about channels and applications, but you can also use bots, for example, to provision a team. I've seen a very interesting example where one of our colleagues, Carmen Ezwen, delivered the session this weekend at Collab Days, where she created a bot where you can just talk to the bot and provision a team. The bot will ask you a few questions, and then, well, you don't have to really do anything, just talk to the bot and your team is being provisioned. That's also something completely different, but it's possible. Azure Logic Apps, we talked about that, PowerShell. You can have a form in SharePoint if you want. You can leverage community initiatives like the PnP provisioning engine, if you're familiar with that. All these capabilities have the possibility to create teams. So the question, of course, is, when to use what? And of course, I'm a consultant, so the default answer is always, it depends, but it really depends. It depends on what you're used to, depends on what you have from a licensing perspective, depends on the technical abilities of the department, of the customer, depends on the complexity of the solution. If it's just a form with 3 questions and an approval, you might just want to use Forms and Power Automate. But if it's something very involved with lots of side steps and checks and whatever, a little bit like I will show you in a few minutes, then you might have to go for something more custom. The amount of orchestration you want to do, the amount of checks and balances that you want to build in, the security that you want to use, the triggers, etc., etc. So there's a lot of factors, and unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all. So I'm going to present you a solution which will, which is available, by the way, free on GitHub. So I will include the reference, the link afterwards. But it's using a lot of building blocks, but it really depends on your situation, what you're actually going to use. So the solution I'm going to demonstrate today is using all these building blocks. So that's a lot. I must say that, and if you're proficient in a few of these technologies, and I will show you the solution, you will probably say, well, maybe that could have been a little bit more simpler. And I agree. It's a quite involved scenario with lots of moving parts that have to talk and wait for each other. But for a demonstration, it's a fantastic example to demonstrate that you can build quite complex solutions with all these different services. But maybe, well, possibly, everything I'm going to show you today is possible through maybe just Power Automate and Power Apps. But depends a little bit on the scenario. A few of the building blocks that are included here in this solution have also put in because of licensing problems, well, licensing issues or potential issues, like what I talked about. Many of the things we're going to do here would also be possible in Power Automate, but because of, to make this solution available for more people, we moved that to Logic Apps, for example. So, but you will see how that works. So, what is a general flow of the application from, let's say, a user perspective? First of all, there's a form that you can fill in to request a new team. You will have to provide the necessary information, depending on the governance strategy. Then the application will check if that team already exists. It will send an approval, or it will start an approval process. And if the approval is given, the team will be created. It's quite simple, actually, from a user perspective. If we look at the different design elements or building blocks of the solution, what are we using in relation to that user flow? The user interface will be integrated into Teams. So the user does not have to go to a specific web page. No, the provisioning engine is already built in Teams. So we will have a Teams app that is powered by Power Apps, which is a capability that is now possible, which is quite convenient. In the past, that was also possible, but yeah, the authentication flow was not perfect. But now, if you create any Power App, you can just use that as an app in Teams, which is really cool, and that's exactly what we did in this solution. So, user interface provided by Teams and Power Apps. Of course, we use Azure Active Directory. That's the foundational building block for everything here. That's why I also included it here. Now, if you request a team, you will do that through a Power App interface in Teams. And if you make a request, that request will be stored inside of SharePoint. Of course, there are other ways to store data in Microsoft 365 or in Azure, but I went for a simple solution. And if you've got Microsoft 365, you already have SharePoint, so you don't have to pay anything extra. So we're storing the Teams requests in a SharePoint list, and everyone can work with a SharePoint list. We're also keeping some state in the SharePoint list. So if your team gets created, or if the team has already been created, or if it's pending approval, that state will be kept inside of the SharePoint list. And we're also keeping some configuration in SharePoint. Why did we choose SharePoint? Because SharePoint is accessible by almost every service there is in the Microsoft 365 or Azure ecosystem. And we have default connectors that point to SharePoint that you don't have to pay extra for. So that's why we use SharePoint. It's also easier. It's also easy to maintain, to look at the different requests, maybe to later integrate other solutions into this provisioning engine, because we're keeping everything in SharePoint. Nowadays, you could also do the same with Microsoft Lists if you want, but that's also a SharePoint list in essence. So that will not be that much different. So if we made our request, that request gets stored into SharePoint, and then there is an approval flow. The approval flow will be done through Power Automate. So there is a Power Automate flow. We still don't know how to call it because it's still a flow inside of Power Automate. It's a little bit annoying, but there is a flow that runs in Power Automate that checks if there is a new request. looks at the SharePoint list, and if there is a new request, it will send an approval, or it will ask approval to a specific group of people. In a demonstration, that's also myself, of course, for convenience, but it can be a group. And then the approver can check the application if there is something to be approved, or we're also using adaptive cards. Adaptive cards is quite cool technology, actually. Those are actionable messages, and you can use them in different platforms, but in this case, we're using them inside of Teams. So the approver does not have to go to our application all the time to see, are there new team requests? Yes or no? No. Teams will automatically notify the approver that there is a new team request, and that will be done through adaptive cards. And it's quite neat functionality that we are leveraging here. If the approval goes through and the team can be created, then then the real engine comes into play. What will happen is the Power Automate will mark the request as approved in the SharePoint list. And then we have some another piece of functionality in Logic Apps, that's Azure, that's not Microsoft 365, who will listen or who will see when a request is being approved. And when the request is being approved, a whole chain of events will get kicked off. I will show you in more detail how that works when we are in the Logic app, but the components that we're leveraging here, of course, is Logic Apps itself, the Microsoft Graph. We are actually creating the team through post and get requests in the Microsoft Graph. We store certain secrets in Azure Key Vault in a secure way. We even use PowerShell in an automation runbook, that's Azure Automation, to check if a team already exists, even if it has been deleted before, stuff like that. So we're using PowerShell, we're using PnP PowerShell, and in the end, if the team gets created, we also send an email to the requester. So we're using all these capabilities. Now, if you look at this diagram, you might ask yourself, okay, what about the costs? This is probably very costly. Well, we estimate, we always have to be a little bit careful, but we estimate that even if you use this solution every day to create like 25 teams a day, that it will probably not cost you more than a few euros a month. So like 5 or 6 euros something. I've tested it out a few times and I paid like 50 cents for a month after creating 20 teams or something. So it's really not that costly. It's a little bit complicated to set up. That's what I'm not going to show you today. Otherwise, we would be here still be here in 5 hours. But that's the architecture of the solution. All right, let me show you how that looks like. Ooh, I almost quit the meeting instead of stop the sharing. It would be. Come on. Let's go. And I like how Teams does not show you which browser version is open. Right. Okay. So this is Teams. Now, the way we architected the application is we integrated it with Teams. There are two possibilities to integrate with our Power App, which is behind. That is using it as a tab. And I've got let me start my favorite tool, zoom it. So we've got a deployment team, which I'm already a member of. And then we have a provisioning channel. And inside of that provisioning channel, we have a tab, which is called Request a Team. And when I click Request a Team, the Power App will launch, and we've got a user interface or custom user interface to request a team. That's one of the possibilities. If you don't like this, you can also have a real Teams app, let's say, and that's what you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, Request a Teams app. And it's exactly the same functionality. So if I click here, well, I have the same user interface. And you can make this Teams app available for all your users, or at least the ones who are able to create a team. So what you can do here, we've got 3 tabs inside of the application. We have Approve Requests, My Requests, and Request a Team. Now, I haven't requested anything, so let's stick to this one. And then we can request a team from scratch or use a template. Let's use a template, and then we've got a list of templates, and remember, those are the built-in ones that I presented you on the slide. Let's take a manage an event. That's I think that's a good one. And then you see which channels and applications that we get in our team. Oh, looks good. Next. Visibility. Every team is private or public. Let's create a public team. Next. Then I have to give a team name. Let's do TechTrain October 2020. A description. TechTrain. The business reason. And so this is one of the examples. This is one of the examples of extra information that you can gather from your users that is not available through the out-of-the-box functionality. So we have to specify a valid business reason because that's part of our governance plan. Now I can't just next my way to the next step. I have to check availability because we don't want people creating teams that already exist, because that will give an error. What we're doing here is when we click this button, a Power Automate flow will go out and check if that team already exists. That's what's been done here. Let's go next. Then we are able to specify not one, but 2 owners or 4 owners, whatever you want. Let's specify myself as an owner, Thomas, and then also Dan, the CEO, Dan Jump, and then a member. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, well, let's not specify a member maybe now. So this is all configurable. Next, review and submit. You've got everything. You have an oversight screen, and then submit your request. The team you request is waiting for approval. You can check the status in my requests. Let's go there. Let's go check status. When you created or when you requested multiple teams, we're now in a different tab. You can have an overview of all the teams you requested. The status is now submitted. In a few seconds, that status will change. But what you see here is all the requests that you submitted. You can, on every request, click on this button, and you can see what exactly it was about. That's what happens here. Now, all these requests are stored in the SharePoint list. But if I go to SharePoint, we have a Teams requests list, and I've got one request here with the request that I just specified. So all the different fields are here. And a lot of different other information like classification, something which we didn't include into the Power App, or the template it's being based on, etc., etc. And we can see that the status is now pending approval. Let's go back to our application. I refresh, and it's pending approval. That means that now the owner of the approval process can go to approve requests, and we'll see all the requests that need to be approved. So this one, you can view details, and if you want, you can just approve here. But of course, like I said before, we don't want the approver to be in this application all the time. So we also had an adaptive card, and that's what we see in the chat window here. So there is an adaptive card in the chat that is messaging me. So we have a pending approval team, TechTrain October 2020. You can approve or reject if you want. Let's approve. You can specify a comment if you want. We're not going to do that. And submit. So you don't have to go to a web page. You can just stay in Teams, interact with this. It's not a bot, but it looks a bit like a bot. Interact here with the Flow or Power Automate engine and get your team created. Let's go back to request a team. Let's go to my requests, and with a little bit of luck, we will see that my request is now approved. Okay, cool. So that means that it's also changed here in the SharePoint side. It's approved. Okay, how does that work? This is the Power App, and I switch to powerapps.com. I've got a request a team app. Now, we don't have time to go into all the details, and that's for another session. But you see, you have an authoring canvas. Oh, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to edit the app. Sorry, edit the app. You've got an authoring canvas in which you can create this application. It looks relatively simple. In the beginning, it is actually quite simple, but the learning curve for Power Apps can be quite steep if it wants to load. take some time. Now, in Power Apps and also in Power Automate and in Logic Apps, you can also define connections to the different systems that you're using. We have a connection to SharePoint, we have a connection to Azure Active Directory, we have a connection to Microsoft Teams. So that's all pre-configured, of course, or that's something I did beforehand. You see, this is the Power Apps editor, but we're not going into detail here. But here is you're able to change the canvas or the functionality of the application. So that's the Power App. If you have created a Power App, the new functionality enables you to add it to Teams. That's quite new. So add to Teams, you will be able to download the zip file that you can upload in Teams and make it available to your organization. That's exactly what I did. Now, the automation part is done through Power Automate, or Microsoft Flow, as it used to call. I've got two flows here. I've got team request approval and check team availability. Let's go for team request approval first. Let's edit. And then you've got a visual representation of the flow that we are using. So we don't have time to go into all the details, unfortunately. But what happens basically is this flow triggers when an item is submitted into the SharePoint list. So once you create your request, it is included into the list, and the Power Automate flow will trigger. And it's you can specify which list it's looking at. We initialize a few variables that we will need later on in our approval flow. We get some settings, and you can see that it can become quite something. And this is nothing compared to the Logic app I'm going to show you. But in the end, it's gathering approvals. It's sending the adaptive card to the approver. It's also updating the SharePoint list item. It's waiting for a response, and then it changes the status to approved. That's what this Power Automate flow does. There is another one that is used by the Power App. Come on. And that's check team availability. This is something completely different. This is not an approval flow. So what it does, it's a trigger based on Power Apps. So in Power Apps, we had a button, check availability, or check if it already exists. And that's the trigger for this flow. And it's using the SharePoint API. I think it's deprecated, but yeah, it still works, to see if that site, because a team also has a site, if that site already exists. And if it doesn't exist, you get a green light. That's what's happening here. Like I said, you can download and install the whole solution from GitHub. I changed a few things, but the general idea is there. So if you want to play around with this afterwards, that's absolutely possible. So we've done this, and the status is now changed to approved. That means something else has to pick it up and actually create the team. And that's what we're doing through Logic Apps. Now we're switching to the Azure portal, where we can see the services that we deployed, and one of them is the Logic app. Now this Logic app also fires by default every hour to look at the same SharePoint list. So it's looking at the SharePoint list, and when something is added that has a status approved, it will do its thing. It will run every hour, but I will run it manually now, because otherwise we'll have to wait until 5 o'clock, maybe 6 o'clock, I don't know. So I let it run in the background. Let's look at our Logic app, and you will see that it's quite similar to Power Automate, only it has a little bit more functionality. And it's also, like I said, from a licensing perspective, that often people choose Logic apps instead of Power Automate for these kinds of scenarios. It's also quite a long Logic app, and especially if I would open one of these different actions, it will get very, very complicated. So what it will do is it will look at the SharePoint site, it will get the request, it will again initialize some variables, it will, in this case here, get a client ID and a client secret from Azure Key Vault. That's where we store our secrets. It will get the user profile of the service account that's running the whole application, etc., etc. It will also check if the SharePoint site exists. And in this case, we're not using Power Automate, but we're using a piece of PowerShell in Azure automation. So you see everything can be combined into one solution if you want. You can probably do this in another way, but this is for demonstration purposes. And then in the end, we are going to create our team. Now, the team is going to be created, and I realize I'm clicking a little bit faster here, but the team is being created through the Microsoft Graph. So what we're doing here is we're posting a message to a specific endpoint in the graph, and then we provide some specific parameters, which are parameters who come from other parts in the logic app, and then we are able to create our team. So we specify a team name, for example, that's a display name here. We specify the owners, etc. We specify the template, the visibility, or any other parameters that we want. And in the end, the team is created. Then the logic app waits for, I think, 2 minutes by default, because creating a team involves creating a group, setting up a SharePoint site, and provisioning a few other things. So that will take some time. And then in the end, we check if the team has been created, and then we send an email to the requester, and then we update in SharePoint. We update the request to be teams created. I hope that the one that I started is already done. Let's see. I think it's still going. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the details of everything. If you've got a running logic app, you can click on that run. Same for Power Automate, by the way, and you can see where it is what it's executing, and it's probably waiting now for 2 minutes because the team has created. No, it's checking out the members. So the team is already created, but it's looping through the members to add them to the team. With a little bit of luck, at the end of my presentation, which is in 4 minutes, that team will be created and populated. Now the team actually is already created. So if we go to Teams, we can probably already see it here, see TechTrain October 2020, but it's not provisioned as we want yet. So it doesn't have the channels, the template isn't applied yet. It doesn't have the right members and owners, but that will come. So that's what the logic app will do. So it's still busy doing its thing. Fortunately, we're not able to wait for that. So demonstration fairly quickly. I realized that it's quite complex, but you see, using all these different building blocks, you're able to create a provisioning engine that suits your need and which is totally customized. This is quite difficult, quite complex, but you can also build something very similar and very simple with just Power Automate and Power Apps, for example. That's possible. You don't have to use Power Logic Apps and automation. If you just want to use PowerShell, that's also possible, even for a provisioning engine. You can run your PowerShell in stuff like Azure Automation or even Azure Functions. Azure Functions is quite cool. It's usually used by, let's say, real developers. I'm not a real developer, but you can use PowerShell in Azure Functions to do the same thing if you want. There is a Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK. That's quite new, actually. So with install module Microsoft.graph, you can use that to create teams. Of course, you want to have something dynamic, so you cannot just create a PowerShell script with create new team with this name. No, it has to be dynamic, so that can take some work. These are a few other ways to leverage PowerShell to create teams. There are the native Microsoft Teams commandlets when you have a new team. There is something from the PNP initiative. There is the Microsoft Graph that I just showed you. That's all possible. Fortunately, demo. And what we did in our presentation, or in our demonstration, sorry, was to create a team directly to the Microsoft Graph. So we had a post request to an HTTP endpoint with all kinds of JSON parameters, quite complicated. But nowadays, if you want, there is also limited, it's still in preview, there is limited capability available in Power Automate and also in Logic Apps to manage teams. So there are actions now to create a team. So you maybe don't want to use this this Logic app if you want something a little bit similar. But I invite you to go to Power Automate and just try one of these newer Microsoft Teams actions, because they might just work for you and provide different capabilities that you want. If you want something very specific with very specific parameters or templates, you probably still have to go to the JSON approach that we showed you. But if you want something standard, fairly standard, you can go for the Power Automate way. With 1 minute left, some key takeaways. There's no one size fits all. So highly depends on your requirements, which capabilities, which building blocks you're going to leverage. It's always a good idea to leverage Teams in itself as a platform to build your solution as an app or integrate in a tab. That way people will always stay into Teams just to request a team, but also to approve a team creation. That's always a good idea. You have to know the Microsoft Graph, whatever technology you're using, even if you're just using PowerShell, get to know the basics of the Microsoft Graph. There's a lot of choice, and some things do almost the same thing. So again, it depends a little bit on your scenario. Also, absolutely dive into the Power Platform. It's getting more powerful every day. You can also now create bots with the drag and drop functionality. It's quite cool. And especially the built-in connectors enable you to connect to everything you probably need and also to create a team. But if you're an IT pro who wants to use PowerShell, creating a team in PowerShell is also possible. So definitely don't dismiss PowerShell. Some useful reading. Of course, these are links, and I will provide or Geert will probably provide the presentation afterwards. These are some very interesting blog articles from some people I know about Teams provisioning. Some are more technical, some are more general information. There's also a link to the Microsoft Graph Teams documentation, and also, last but not least, a link to the Request a Team app on GitHub, which I modified slightly to show to you today. And then I think we're out of time, so I want to thank you for your attendance. I hope you found it useful. If you want the session materials, they are available on my GitHub page, and scanning this QR code will also lead you right to that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Thomas, there still was a question by Christoph.
Okay.
If it is possible to only allow a user to create a team using a template, but not from scratch, so probably only using a template.
I don't think that's possible by default. Of course, if you're creating something yourself, like I showed you, you're able to restrict the templates, but I don't think that's possible. But I might be mistaken.
Okay, thank you. So great, that's it. Thank you all for attending. As Thomas said, I will put everything up so that you can actually you'll find the links via the meetup site. So that you can actually have a link to the video, but also to the presentation. And then we hope to see you again next time, end of November somewhere, for another TechTrain event. Thanks you for attending, and bye-bye.